Tava kathamritam tapta jivanam kavibiriditam kalmashapaham Shravanamangalam Shrimadatatam Bhuigananti Bhurida Jana. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to our ongoing class on the Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna. The only difference today compared to the previous class is that it's being held on a Thursday. But it's a continuation of the class we've been doing on Wednesdays. So today we're discussing the entry from Sunday, October 22nd, 1882. And what I'll do as usual is read a portion of Nikhilanji's English translation and then reflect on some aspects of it and sometimes look at the original Bengali as well when I think it's necessary. So first of all, there's a chapter title given by M in the Bengali original. So it's chapter 6, Shashto Porichid, Sri Ramakrishna Vijaya Divoshe, Dokhineshwar Mandire Bhakto Sange. Sri Ramakrishna with devotees in Dokhineshwar on the day of the immersion of Mother Durga. So the last day of Durga Puja. That's the title of the chapter. So let's plunge in. It was the day of Vijaya, the last day of the celebration of the worship of Durga, when the clay image is immersed in the water of a lake or river. About 9 o'clock in the morning, M was seated on the floor of the master's room at Dokhineshwar, near Sri Ramakrishna, who was reclining on the small couch. Rakhal was then living with the master, and Narendra and Bhavanath visited him frequently. Baburam had seen him only once or twice. So I'll pause here briefly because there's a missing sentence as far as I can tell. Not like of crucial importance, but one of the nice things about the gospel is that M was such a meticulous observer, and he recorded every single person, or as many as he could tell, as he knew, the names of the people who were actually present at the time. And so the missing sentence here is in Bangla, Ram, Monomohan, Suresh, Master, Boloram, Iharao pray proti saptahe Thakurke darshan koriya jan. Which means, so what's actually written here in the English is, Rakhal was then living with the master, Narendra and Bhavanath visited him frequently, but these people's names are not mentioned. In the original Bengali, it's also mentioned that Ram, presumably that means Ramchandra Datta, the cousin of Swami Medhananda, Monomohan, Suresh, Mastad, meaning the author of the Gospel, M, and Bolaram. The sentence says, the Bengali says, all of these devotees come weekly, at least once a week, in order to see Sri Ramakrishna. So that's the sentence that is missing in Nikhilanji's translation, so I'm just mentioning that. So let's continue. Sri Ramakrishna, did you have any holiday during the Durga Puja? M, yes, sir. I went to Kesab's house every day for the first 3 days of the worship. Kesab meaning Kesab Chandra Sen, the great leader of the Brahma Samaj, or one of the factions or sects of the Brahma Samaj. Master, is that so? M, I heard there a very interesting interpretation of the Durga Puja. Master, please tell me all about it. If anyone wants to follow along, it's pages 126 and following of Nikhilanji's translation. Sorry. Okay, so Sri Ramakrishna, please tell me all about it. M. Kesab Sen held daily morning prayers in his house, lasting till 10 or 11. During these prayers, he gave the inner meaning of the Durga Puja. He said that if anyone could realize the Divine Mother, that is to say, could install Mother Durga in the shrine of his heart, then Lakshmi, Saraswati, Kartika, and Ganesha would come there of themselves. What are these names? There's a footnote here, helpfully supplied by Nikhilanji. According to Hindu mythology, Lakshmi and Saraswati are the daughters, and Kartika and Ganesha, the sons of Durga. Associated with the image of Durga, they occupy positions on both sides of the Divine Mother. You'll see the iconography of Durga when we have Durga Puja, that Lakshmi and Saraswati on one side of Durga and Kartika and Ganesha on the other side. So Kesab is giving a kind of symbolic interpretation of this. Then M is continuing to explain Keshab's interpretation of this Durga Puja. Kesab says, Lakshmi means wealth, Saraswati knowledge, Kartika strength, and Ganesha success. By realizing the Divine Mother within one's heart, one gets all these without any effort whatever. Sri Ramakrishna listened to the description, questioning M now and then about the prayers conducted by Kesab. At last, he said to M, "Don't go hither and thither. Come here alone. Those who belong to the inner circle of my devotees will come only here. Boys like Narendra, Bhavanath, and Rakhal are my very intimate disciples. They are not to be thought lightly of. Feed them one day. What do you think of Narendra?" M, "I think very highly of him, sir." Master, "Haven't you observed his many virtues? He is not only well versed in music, vocal and instrumental, but he is also very learned. Besides, he has controlled his passions and declares he will lead a celibate life. He has been devoted to God since his very boyhood." Okay, let's pause here and discuss a few things. First of all, M, even after meeting Sri Ramakrishna for a few months, is still frequenting Kesab Shen's spiritual programs, and M didn't see it as a problem. So during Durga Puja, he attended Keshab's Durga Puja and explained to Sri Ramakrishna Keshab's interpretation. But I think it's pretty clear that Sri Ramakrishna was not too happy that M was going there. And I think it's worth reflecting on why. Let's look a little bit more carefully at this interpretation of Keshab's. He says, if you can install Mother Durga in the shrine of his heart, in the shrine of your heart, then these four gods and goddesses also come of themselves. Lakshmi, Saraswati, Kartika, Ganesha, representing what? Wealth, knowledge, strength, and success. And then Kesab says, by realizing Divine Mother within one's heart, one gets all these without any effort whatever. And I suspect that what Sri Ramakrishna doesn't necessarily like so much is this attempt to combine yoga and bhoga. That yoga, spiritual practice, can go hand in hand with worldly prosperity. So in Christianity, especially as preached in some parts of the US, there's this whole thing called the prosperity gospel. So the idea that if you surrender to Jesus and love Jesus, you don't actually have to renounce anything. And in fact, the opposite is true. If you worship Jesus, you'll get all sorts of worldly goods at the same time. You'll become rich, you'll become famous, you'll become successful. And there's something appealing about it, but it's also a kind of dilution of the spiritual message, it seems to me. So I think that might be why Sri Ramakrishna, at least partly why he's discouraging M from attending Keshab's lectures, his discourses, because of course Kesab was a householder. He was very spiritually evolved, but at the same time a householder. And Sri Ramakrishna would often say that Kesab has kind of one foot in the world and one foot in spirituality. But he's kind of torn between these two things. Okay, so that's one thing. And I forgot to mention actually that right after M mentions Keshab's interpretation, in the original Bengali, a new section of the chapter begins. And that section is titled by M, Thakur Sri Ramakrishna's Narendradi Antarango. Sri Ramakrishna's Antaranga, his inner circle, in the form of Narendra and others. And it's a little section just of a couple sentences, but and I've already read it. Now, Sri Ramakrishna is saying to M, don't go hither and thither, come here alone. Those who belong to the inner circle of my devotees will come only here. How do we interpret this? Because it seems to me at least that superficially, this might raise some questions or doubts in our mind. Because we know that Sri Ramakrishna taught the harmony of all spiritual and religious paths, and that he was extremely broad. And so here, what's happening? Why is he discouraging M from attending a service in a different tradition, in the Brahma Samaj? What do you think? I'm actually curious. Do you have any thoughts about this? And do we have a mic to bring? Yeah, can you give it to Bala?
Just going with some of the other examples also where Holy Mother told, no, this is the better mantra for you. I think Sri Ramakrishna is indicating it's just for these people
For
who
M,
are his
or
inner,
maybe specifically
M and the
M, he's talking
inner people,
Yeah.
that it might distract them from, I think, getting to the goal faster.
Yeah, I think that's a nice point. We always have to remember that Sri Ramakrishna could see into the hearts of the people he's speaking to, and he's giving tailored advice to particular people. There's a place, just in this context, but somewhere else in the gospel, when Sri Ramakrishna tells Naren, with a very tender look in his eyes, you cannot achieve anything spiritually unless you renounce lust and greed. And then a householder disciple is there, or a devotee is sitting there, and he goes, what? But where does that leave us? I mean, we're married. And he goes, that wasn't for you. That's for Naren. You can do whatever you want, but I'm speaking to Naren. So I think that's true. You have to look at the context. That's part of it. Any other thoughts about this? Why he's discouraging M from attending Keshab's service? Partly, I also think that it has to do with having one-pointed dedication to your own spiritual ideal, so that you can avoid confusion and conflict, inner conflict. I'll just mention one example of somebody I know who is initiated in two different spiritual traditions. He's received a mantra in our tradition and also in another tradition. And it generates a lot of confusion. And he's often flitting back and forth between these two traditions and the meditation. He's been given two different sets of meditation instructions. And so that creates confusion. So I think partly it's also that it's better, once you've picked a tradition, stick to it and go deep. Sri Ramakrishna would say, if you want to dig for water, which is 10 feet deep, and you start digging in one place, and then after a few minutes, you get bored and you decide to move 5 feet away and then start digging there. He said, you'll never strike the water, right? So dive deep in your particular tradition. We need depth and intensity. Okay. This also reminds me of Narendra, Swami Vivekananda, after Sri Ramakrishna leaves his body. Somebody of the spiritual stature of Sri Ramakrishna, Swami Vivekananda himself, he has some lingering doubts about whether going all in on Sri Ramakrishna is a good idea or not. So when he visits Pavhari Baba in Ghazipur, he's quite impressed. He's taken by him, to the point where he decides, I'm going to get initiated by Pavhari Baba, even though he's, of course, already the disciple of Sri Ramakrishna. Sri Ramakrishna had already left his body in 1886, so he's no longer with us, or he's with us, but I mean, he wasn't physically there. And so he's about to get initiated, and he resolves to get initiated by Pavhari Baba. Then what happens? He has this very powerful vision of Sri Ramakrishna looking at him with tears in his eyes and with just a silent expression, not saying one word, but just making him feel really guilty and bad about even considering getting initiated by somebody else. And so that day he decides, okay, I won't get initiated. Still not convinced though. So then the next day he resolves to get initiated again by Pavhari Baba. Again, the moment he thinks about it, he gets the same vision of Sri Ramakrishna, tears in his eyes, silent countenance. And this goes on for days until finally Swami Vivekananda just surrenders at the feet of Sri Ramakrishna and says, now I realize there's no one but him. So this happens to the best of us. But I think it's useful to keep this in mind, that once you've committed to a tradition, it's better not to flit around and be a spiritual dilettante. Okay. I want to mention some small little things here regarding what he says about his beloved Naren, the future Swami Vivekananda. Sri Ramakrishna, he asks M, what do you think of Narendra? And M says, I think very highly of him, sir. And Sri Ramakrishna says, a little bit down, he says, besides, he has so many qualities, and he says, besides, he has controlled his passions and declares he will lead a celibate life. I just want to make a little humorous comment here. The original Bengali here is about Jitendriya. Actually, Jitendriya means he has conquered his senses, Jita Indriya, right? And declares he will lead a celibate life. In fact, the original is boleche biye korbe na. So it's not quite the same thing. He says in Bengali, he says he will not marry. And it's just a little thing. But Niklanji, I think in a sense wisely for a Western audience, translates this as declares he will lead a celibate life, because just being unmarried doesn't mean that you're going to be leading a celibate life, especially in the West. It could mean that you're going to be less celibate than even a married person. So I think that's why Niklanji, just to clarify things, he says he's not going to marry, but he's going to lead a celibate life. Okay. So no dating and all these things. All right. All right, so let's continue. Sri Ramakrishna asking M. How are you getting along with your meditation nowadays? What aspect of God appeals to your mind, with form or without form? M. Sir, now I can't fix my mind on God with form. On the other hand, I can't concentrate steadily on God without form. Master. Now you see that the mind cannot be fixed all of a sudden on the formless aspect of God. It is wise to think of God with form during the primary stages. M. Do you mean to suggest that one should meditate on clay images? Master. Why clay? These images are the embodiments of consciousness. M. Even so, one must think of hands, feet, and the other parts of the body. But again, I realize that the mind cannot be concentrated unless one meditates in the beginning on God with form. You have told me so. Well, God can easily assume different forms. May one meditate on the form of one's own mother? Interesting question. Master. Yes, the mother should be adored. She is indeed an embodiment of Brahman. M sat in silence. I'll read a little bit more, then we'll pause. After a few minutes, he asked the master, what does one feel while thinking of God without form? Isn't it possible to describe it? After some reflection, the master said, do you know what it is like? He remained silent a moment and then said a few words to M about one's experiences at the time of the vision of God with and without form. Master. You see, one must practice spiritual discipline to understand this correctly. Suppose there are treasures in a room. If you want to see them and lay hold of them, you must take the trouble to get the key and unlock the door. After that, you must take the treasures out. But suppose the room is locked, and standing outside the door, you say to yourself, here I have opened the door. Now I have broken the lock of the chest. Now I have taken out the treasure. Such brooding near the door will not enable you to achieve anything. You must practice discipline. Okay, so let's pause here. There are quite a few things to discuss. First of all, some small translation things. It's fine, but I just wanted to mention what the original is. So the question he asks M is, Tomar ajkal ishwar chinta ki roop hocche? And actually, it's the beginning of a new section. And the new section M titles, Shakar na Nirakar, Chinmoy Murti Dhyan, Matri Dhyan. So it's a three-part section title. The first part says, Shakar na Nirakar, which means, is God with form or without form? Then, Chinmoy Murti Dhyan, meditation on an image in the form of, or no, let me just put it this way. Meditation on an embodiment of consciousness. Chinmayi Murti. We'll get to that, what that means in a second. And then the third part of this section heading is Matri Dhyan, which is quite interesting. Meditation on your own flesh and blood mother. Okay? So it really gives a nice synoptic overview of this section, what the main topics are. So, Sri Ramakrishna's question is, Tomar ajkal ishwar chinta ki roop hocche? Which means, how is your meditation on God going? And I just mentioned that because the way that it's rendered here in English is, how are you getting along with your meditation nowadays? But it's actually Ishvara Chinta, which means your meditation on Ishvara, on God. And the terms for with form and without form are Shakar and Nirakar. Sakara, Nirakara. These are used all the time in the gospel. And actually, I want to focus in the remainder of this class on what exactly these terms mean, what are some of the nuances of these terms. First of all, Sri Ramakrishna is asking M, which do you like more? Which do you like meditating on more, thinking of more? God with form or God without form? And the terms are nirakara, sakara. Now, the first thing to keep in mind here, just philosophically speaking, is we can think about the nature of ultimate reality along two axes. One axis is the nirakara, sakara axis. Formless on one side and with form on the other. But there's another axis. I don't know, if we do X and Y, I don't know, I forgot all my math. Anyway, we have nirguna and saguna. Okay, nirguna means impersonal without attributes. Saguna means personal with attributes. Okay? Now, we can have multiple permutations. We can have nirguna, nirakara. Impersonal, attributeless, that's nirguna. And nirakara, formless. Which spiritual tradition or traditions uphold this conception of ultimate reality? Classical Advaita Vedanta, Shankara's school of Advaita Vedanta. Very good. The impersonal, non-dual, absolute or pure consciousness, right? But we can also have nirakara saguna, formless but personal with attributes. This is a little bit more subtle. What traditions uphold a conception of ultimate reality as personal with the omni attributes of the personal God, like omniscience, omnipotence, perfectly loving, creator of this world, the sustainer of this world, the destroyer of this world, all those things, and yet they don't believe that God has form. Any suggestions? Dvaita. What? Dvaita. Dvaita means dualism, dualistic Vedanta, do you mean? Madhva school? But they believe in God with form, actually. So that's sakara saguna. That's God, the personal God with form. But I'm asking, which spiritual traditions believe in God as formless but personal at the same time? Abrahamic religions, yeah, very good. Christianity is always tricky, though, because, they got the Trinity thing, they've got Jesus, who's the incarnation, and so that is God with form. It's an avatar, it's an incarnation, right? But yes, God the Father clearly is nirakara saguna. It would be the formless personal. Holy Spirit's very tricky in Christian theology, but that could arguably be interpreted as a kind of formless but personal. Any other suggestions? Vishishtadvaita. Vishishtadvaita is Ramanuja's school, and like Madhva's Dvaita Vedanta, they also believe in Vishnu as having form. And Ramanuja has these beautiful artistic descriptions, poetic descriptions of Vishnu's earrings and the mace he's holding and all these things. He's lying on a shesha, on a serpent bed. So no, that's God with form as well. So we're not there. Any other suggestions? New Age, that's interesting. You mean, you're thinking of contemporary times. Okay, that's interesting, right? But not talking about a form. Yeah, so that would, it could be an example. I don't know Ram Dass well enough to say for sure, but the gentleman here, what's your name again? Sorry, Tay is suggesting that Ram Dass's kind of New Age approach to God as loving awareness, as a kind of formless loving awareness. That could be an example of a formless but personal God. Good, yeah. What about in Sri Ramakrishna's own time? Islam is definitely, exactly, nirakara saguna, formless but personal. Islam is all about bhakti, devotion. And yet, Islam rejects all forms of God. They don't even believe that Christ is an incarnation. They believe that Christ was a prophet, but they don't believe that he was God. They don't believe that he even died on the cross. And they don't believe in any forms of God. And so you'll see in mosques, there are no forms of God. That's prohibited, to worship forms of God. Yeah. It's a very you need to use the mic so that other people can. It's a very important question.
Would pantheism be an impersonal God with form?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. Let me put it this way. So, see, okay, even among spiritual traditions which hold that ultimate reality is personal but formless, okay, and so we've already mentioned a couple, but let me also mention. I'll come back to your question, but. So Islam definitely believes that God is personal but formless, but so does Brahma Samaj. And so does Sikhism. Okay. But now, notice that at least Sikhism, I know for sure, because I've studied the Guru Granth Sahib, which is the main scripture, which is full of these beautiful songs about God in the form of formless but personal. And you'll find in these songs that Guru Nanak and these other great saints in the Sikh tradition, they're describing God as formless but personal. So it's all bhakti, it's all devotional. And like loving awareness and God is our master and all these things, we're his servant, all those things. And at the same time that God is all pervasive. Panentheism, actually. So there are two terms. You use the term pantheism, but let me discuss two terms here. Pantheism is the view that this world is God and nothing over and above God. So the world exhausts God's nature, that God doesn't have a transcendent aspect beyond this world. Panentheism, if you just add that en in the middle of it, this is the view that this world is God, but that God's nature is not exhausted by this world. That God is not only immanent in this world, but God is also transcendent. God is also beyond this world. Okay. So Sikhism seems to me to be a form of panentheism. Sikhism believes in God as personal but formless, and yet as manifesting as I don't want to say necessarily manifesting as this entire world, but at the very least, inhabiting everything in this world. Okay, as antaryami, as the inner controller in each of us, but literally also inhabiting rocks and trees and so on and so forth. Okay, and I think the thrust of your question is, which I think is really important, is, well, isn't that a kind of form? Was that kind of the... Yeah, and I think that's right. I think that because if you reject the idea of God manifesting as Durga and as Ganesha and as Christ, as a human being, for instance, as an incarnation, then why are you inclined to accept that God can manifest as a chair and as a tree? And at least if you're also holding that God resides in the hearts of all creatures, right? So is it a huge step to say that God can also manifest in the form of Krishna and Ganesha? Is that the intuition behind the question, or is it something different?
That's basically it.
Yeah. So I think that's a very reasonable line of argument, and I think that would be a way of defending or kind of pressing people who believe in God as formless but personal, but who also accept panentheism or pantheism, to say, well, look at these two tenets that you accept. Don't they lead in the direction of accepting God with form as well, in the form of these different deities? Yeah, that's a nice question. Thank you. Yes, so Brahma Samaj. Now, M was strongly influenced by the Brahma Samaj before he came to Sri Ramakrishna, like Narayan himself, right? And so he was conditioned to think of God as formless but personal. And so that's how he answers Sri Ramakrishna's question. M says, I can't fix my mind on God with form. It's just somehow he doesn't take to God with form. At the same time, he's having trouble meditating on the formless God. So he's really stuck between a rock and a hard place. And then Sri Ramakrishna says it's wise to think of God with form during the primary stages. Now we get to an interesting discussion. Why? Because way back when we started this gospel class, when I was discussing M's second visit to Sri Ramakrishna, they already had a discussion about so-called image worship or idol worship. So let me remind you of the discussion. This is during M's second visit. Sri Ramakrishna asks M, well, do you believe in God with form or without form? Deja vu. Okay, M, rather surprised, said to himself, how can one believe in God without form when one believes in God with form? And if one believes in God without form, how can one believe that God has a form? Can these two contradictory ideas be true at the same time? Can a white liquid like milk be black? M, sir, I like to think of God as formless. Sri Ramakrishna, very good. It is enough to have faith in either aspect. You believe in God without form. That is quite all right. But never for a moment think that this alone is true and all else false. Remember that God with form is just as true as God without form, but hold fast to your own conviction. The assertion that both are equally true amazed M. He had never learnt this from his books. Thus his ego received a third blow. So on this meeting, his ego received 3 blows. The first was when Sri Ramakrishna asked him whether he was married, and he said yes. And the second time was when Sri Ramakrishna asked whether he had children, and he said yes. So 2 blows. And then the third blow is this one, which he's about to get. And then M continues, but since it was not yet completely crushed, meaning his ego, he came forward to argue with the master a little more. So remember, this is M's second visit. M, sir, suppose one believes in God with form. Certainly God is not the clay image. Master, interrupting, but why clay? It is an image of spirit. Mati kenogo, chinmoy pratima. One thing I'll point out here, small translation issue. I'm reading Nichilanji's translation of M's second visit. And the original Bengali here is Chinmoy Pratima. Sri Ramakrishna says, why are you talking about clay images? It's not clay images. Chinmoy, it's Chinmayi Pratima. It's the embodiment of divine consciousness. But Nikhilanji here translates it as an image of spirit. But the same term, more or less, used later, the one that we just read for today's class, and it's almost the same term. It's Chinmoy Murti. So in the M second visit, it's Chinmoy Pratima. Pratima and Murti are basically synonyms. It means image. Okay, and Chinmayi is exactly the same word, divine consciousness. So Chinmayi Murti, Chinmayi Pratima in M second visit, Nikhilanji translates as an image of spirit. And here, Nikhilanji is translating Chinmayi Murti as embodiments of consciousness. And I actually like the latter translation better, embodiments of divine consciousness, something like that. And I think that it's a little surprising that he's not consistent in rendering the same Bengali phrase in the same way. I don't think image of spirit is as clear and as expressive, actually. Okay, so that's one thing. Then, let me just continue describing M's second visit, then that'll give us a context to discuss the present passage. M could not quite understand the significance of this phrase, embodiment of divine consciousness, Chinmoy Pratima. But sir, he said to the master, one should explain to those who worship the clay image that it is not God, and that while worshiping it, they should have God in view and not the clay image. One should not worship clay. Master, sharply, that's the one hobby of you Calcutta people. Giving lectures and bringing others to the light. Nobody ever stops to consider how to get the light himself. Who are you to teach others? And then he goes on and he smashes his ego. And then at the end of this, M says, this was M's first argument with the master and happily his last. Beautiful. And yet, a few months later, we're here and they're having a similar, at least, discussion or debate about, not exactly a debate this time, but a discussion at least, about meditating on God with form versus without form, right? It's the same kind of discussion. Again, M clearly says he's favoring the formless God. And then M is still kind of hung up on this idea of worshiping God with form and thinking that, what are you telling me to do? Worship clay? So he hasn't quite learned his lesson yet, as far as I can tell. He's not arguing with Sri Ramakrishna, but he still has the same kind of doubts, which I find striking. And Sri Ramakrishna gives him the same answer again. Why are you calling these images clay? These images are the embodiments of divine consciousness. Chinmoy Pratima, right? Chinmoy Murti here in this passage. I think that it takes M a long time to really internalize this teaching because it requires quite like a new philosophical framework for thinking about God and thinking about this world. Because Brahma Samaj doesn't emphasize the immanence of God in the same way, like going back to your question, Dinesh. Whereas Sri Ramakrishna, one of the keynote of his teachings philosophically is Vijnana Vedanta, which is that if you attain the spiritual state of Vijnana, you'll see that literally everything is divine consciousness, without any exception. The Vijnani sees, Sri Ramakrishna says, that Brahman has become the 24 cosmic principles. That literally the chairs you're sitting on, that the pillow, the microphone, everything is God. Everything is divine consciousness. If everything is divine consciousness, how can the image of God not be divine consciousness, right? And then it's just a question of degree of manifestation of divine consciousness. That's the only difference between the pillow and me and Jesus, for instance, is that varying degrees of manifestation of the same divine consciousness. That's the idea, right? And so Sri Ramakrishna, from the standpoint of Vijnana Vedanta, when he's saying that the image of God that is worshipped by believers in God with form, he's saying that during that worship, let's say it's Durga Puja, because it's Durga Puja, we're talking about Durga Puja. Let's talk about Durga Puja. We're worshiping Mother Durga in the form of this image, this beautiful image. in a Hindu puja, what happens? There are precise steps in the ritualistic puja, and one aspect or one part of that ritual is prana pratishtha, which means you invoke the deity and invite the deity to inhabit the image. And at that point, the image becomes suffused with divine consciousness. It doesn't mean that it was just clay before. It was already divine consciousness, but there's a special manifestation of the divine in the image during the period of that worship, if the worship is conducted properly and with sincerity and with a particular spiritual attitude. That's the idea. Is that image itself, that clay image, is an even greater manifestation of divine consciousness. And then what happens? At the end of the puja, mother is invited to leave the image, vacate the image, and then she leaves. And then the image is immersed. This is the day of the immersion of Durga Puja. And you might be wondering, why are we throwing God into the ocean? That seems strange and cruel. But no, the point is, now she has vacated it. It's still divine consciousness at some level because everything is divine, but so is the ocean. So you're throwing divine consciousness into divine consciousness. So at that point, there's no harm done. Okay, so in any case, that's the background, which I think it takes M quite a while, months, years, to kind of really assimilate and internalize. That if everything is God, it stands to reason that the image that even the clay image is also God, right? And that it's perfectly fine to worship God in that form. And there's another aspect to Vijnana Vedanta, which comes up later in the gospel. Sri Ramakrishna uses the example of an infinite ocean, which he likens, or he says, imagine infinite Satchitananda as a vast infinite ocean, okay? Existence, conscious bliss. And Sri Ramakrishna says, under the cooling influence of the gentle breeze of bhakti, devotion, that ocean forms into ice at different places of different shapes and sizes. Each one of those ice forms corresponds to some form of the personal God. Okay, one can be Christ, one can be, I was about to say Allah, but no, that's dangerous because he doesn't have form. So it wouldn't be accurate. But Ganesha and Krishna, let's say, and some other things. Okay. Next, he says, but with the rising of the sun of knowledge, the ice forms melt. Okay. At this point, if the parable stops here, followers of Shankara would feel vindicated. And they'll say, see, when you attain the highest knowledge of Brahman, the ice forms melt, which proves that that forms of God are somehow a lower reality. They're not the ultimate truth. But then the parable goes on, and Sri Ramakrishna adds, but in some places, the ice doesn't melt at all. He says it becomes like quartz. And then he uses the term nitya sakara. There's such a thing as eternal forms of God, which are never sublated. They never melt. They never go away. They're not temporary. They're permanent. They're eternal, right? And so all of this philosophical background, I think, is necessary to finally convince M of the validity of so-called image worship, okay? So I think there's a lot here, and I think he's still, this is, as Sri Ramakrishna would say, as long as I live, so long do I learn. And this is definitely a learning curve, a learning process for him. And he's not fully there yet. I mean, we're witnessing this gradual evolution from a Brahma Samaj person who doesn't believe in God with form and is kind of puffed up with a little bit of ego because of his learning and other things, to becoming, completely dedicated at the feet of Sri Ramakrishna and fully accepting his own teachings, Sri Ramakrishna's teachings. Okay, so now, what else do I have to say? Oh, another very interesting translation issue. I think this is quite fascinating. M asks a really interesting question because now he's struggling. Like, Sri Ramakrishna is clearly telling him again and again, stick to God with form, meditate on God with form, but temperamentally, he's just disinclined to think about four-armed goddesses, and he thinks it's somehow anthropomorphic or funny. It just doesn't feel right to him. So now he comes up with an idea. Okay, well, there's one form of God, arguably, that maybe I could feel comfortable meditating on, my own mother. So is that okay? So he asks Sri Ramakrishna, is it okay to meditate on my own mother? And Nikalanji translates Sri Ramakrishna's response as follows. Yes, the mother should be adored. She is indeed an embodiment of Brahman. But the original Bengali is, Tini Guru ar Brahmamoy Sharupa. So that first part of the sentence is what's interesting. Tini Guru is the original Bengali. Mother is Guru. Your physical mother, your flesh and blood mother, is your Guru. And Nikanji renders it as the mother should be adored. This is actually a quite different meaning, it seems to me. There are a lot of things that you can adore. You can adore your dog, but he may not be your guru, right? But mother is your guru. It's a very strong statement. And because mother is your guru, it is perfectly okay, and in fact a good thing, for you to meditate on your mother as God. So that's an important detail, I think, which it's easy to overlook. And finally, before we move on to the next section, I wanted to raise a question here regarding toward the end of what I just read. M asks Sri Ramakrishna, what does one feel while thinking of God without form? In fact, feel here is, it's see, because the Bengali is Moni. Nirakare kirokom dekha jai. Dekha means seeing. So, how do you visualize the formless God? It's almost a paradoxical question, but in any case, maybe that's why Nikanji renders it as feel. What does one feel while thinking of God without form? But actually, M is asking, Nirakare kirokom dekha jai. Like, how do you visualize God without form? Okay, and then M asks, isn't it possible to describe it? And then Sri Ramakrishna says, do you know what it is like? He remained silent a moment and then said a few words to M about one's experiences at the time of the vision of God with and without form. I'm a little puzzled here. My puzzlement is, throughout the over 1,000 pages of the Gospel, M has no problem quoting Sri Ramakrishna saying the most extraordinary things about his own spiritual experiences, esoteric stuff. He says, I see there are very few people here. Now I'm going to tell you some very secret things. And he tells them sometimes really weird things. And why in the world does he omit this? And he guesses as to what. I don't understand why. But Sri Ramakrishna clearly tells him something which he's not actually mentioning here. And I'm wondering why. And I can't figure it out. I mean, the only time I think M deliberately omits something is when he's giving specific spiritual instructions to M. Because it's private, and like if he's giving a mantra or something. Does this fall in that category? I mean, it seems like he's just going to explain a technique of meditation on the formless. And if that's the case, I don't see why M is omitting that, unless it's something very personalized, maybe. I mean, that's my only guess, that it might have been something very personal to M, which he felt that he couldn't divulge to the public. Because there are other places in the Gospel when Sri Ramakrishna actually describes formless meditation. He'll give examples. It's like meditating on a bird flying in the vast sky, or like a fish in the ocean of Satchitana. Like he gives sort of analogies like that. So it can't just be that. It might be something extra which M is not sharing with the rest of us. Anyway, I do think that's interesting. So I just want to mention that. Why does he omit this? Now, let me read one more section. This is actually the beginning of a new chapter in the original Bengali, chapter 7, Shoptam Porichid. And the chapter title is, it's a beautiful title, Thakur Ananto o Ananto Ishwar, Shokoli Pantha, Sri Brindavan Darshan. It's a 3-part chapter title. First, Sri Ramakrishna is infinite, Ananta. And God is infinite, Ananto Ishwar. And then the second section heading, second part of the chapter title is Shokoli Pantha. All fades are paths to the same goal. And Sri Brindavan Darshan, he describes his visit to Vrindavan, the holy place for Vaishnavas and for spiritual aspirants. And then M has a section heading for the first section of this chapter. In this section heading is as follows: Gyanid Mate Ashanko Avatar. In the view of Gyanis, followers of the path of knowledge, Ashanka Avatar, Asankhya Avatara, there are countless, there are innumerable incarnations. And Kutichok, we'll discuss it next time when we talk about that passage. And then Tittokeno, why do you go on pilgrimage? Why does one go on pilgrimage? What's the value of spiritual pilgrimages? Okay, so, but we're just going to focus on just the first part. So, let's read the beginning of this chapter. It's the same date, October 22nd, 1882. Sri Ramakrishna says, the Gyanis think of God without form. They don't accept the divine incarnation. Praising Sri Krishna, Arjuna said, "Thou art Brahman absolute." Sri Krishna replied, "Follow me and you will know whether or not I am Brahman absolute." So saying, Sri Krishna led Arjuna to a certain place and asked him what he saw there. "I see a huge tree," said Arjuna, "and on it I notice fruits hanging like clusters of blackberries. Then Krishna said to Arjuna, "Come near and you will find that these are not clusters of blackberries, but clusters of innumerable Krishnas like me, hanging from the tree." In other words, divine incarnations without number appear and disappear on the tree of the absolute Brahman. Kabir Das was strongly inclined to the formless God. At the mention of Krishna's name, he would say, "Why should I worship him?" The gopis would clap their hands while he performed a monkey dance with a smile. But I accept God with form when I am in the company of people who believe in that ideal. And I also agree with those who believe in the formless God. M, smiling. You are as infinite as he of whom we have been talking, he with a capital H, meaning God. Truly no one can fathom your depth. Master, smiling. Ah, I see you have found it out. Let me tell you one thing. One should follow various paths. One should practice each creed for a time. In a game of satrancha, a piece cannot reach the center square until it completes the circle. But once in the square, it cannot be overtaken by any other piece. M, that is true, sir. Let's pause, because there's a lot to unpack here and to discuss, I think. He says the Gyanis think of God without form, okay? He says, Gyanira niraka chinta kore. Gyanis, followers of the path of knowledge, like to think about the nirakara, formless. But again, remember, there are two forms of the personal, that sounds paradox. There are two ways of thinking about the formless ultimate reality. One is as nirakara saguna, formless but personal. The other is nirakara nirguna, which is the impersonal, attributeless, pure consciousness of classical Advaita Vedanta. Now, when he says Gyanis, presumably he means followers of the path of classical Advaita Vedanta, which means nirakara nirguna, right? But then, I'm genuinely a little bit confused here, and I would like your take on this. He brings up Kabir. And he says Kabir was strongly inclined to the formless God. The Bengali for this is Kabir dasher nirakarer upor khub jhonk chilo. He liked the formless. He had a tendency toward the formless. But what was Kabir's conception of God? Was it formless but personal, nirakara saguna, or formless but impersonal, like the Brahman of classical Advaita Vedanta? Any Kabir experts here? Any thoughts on? I'm sure some of you have heard some Kabir bhajans. I've heard a few. The thing that's confusing to me is sometimes he does. Even Sri Ramakrishna himself was fond of quoting a song of Kabir's where he says, Sri Ramakrishna will say, where does it go? God is everywhere. Oh, I can't find it. Okay, but there's a place where he says, basically, Kabir says, Nirakar, the God with form is my father and God without form is my mother. Do you guys remember? If anyone has read the whole gospel, you'll know that. And he quotes Kabir saying that several times in the gospel. And in one place, the context is the chameleon parable, where he's talking about this Vijnana Vedanta conception of the ultimate reality as with form, without form. The chameleon is red and green and orange and form and colorless. And the man sitting under the tree is the one who sees the chameleon in various colors. He's the Vijnani. And then he quotes Kabir saying, basically that he accepts both the formless and God with form and God without form. So in certain places in the gospel, Sri Ramakrishna seems to suggest that Kabir was a kind of Vijnana Vedantan who believed in ultimate reality as both with form and without form. He equally accepted both. Here he's suggesting that Kabir was strongly inclined to the formless. And in another place in the gospel, he says it even more emphatically, which just adds to my confusion. December 22nd, 1883, Sri Ramakrishna says, one should not discuss the discipline of the impersonal Brahman or the path of knowledge with a bhakta. Through great effort, perhaps he is just cultivating a little devotion. You will injure it if you explain away everything as a mere dream. This is clearly the path of knowledge in the form of classical Advaita Vedanta, Brahma Satyam Jagat Mithya, impersonal, attributeless, pure consciousness alone is real. This world is unreal. The personal God is unreal, right? Immediately after that, what does he say? Kabir was a worshiper of the impersonal God. This is Nikalanji's translation. We have to see but I think it's Nirakara. He was a worshiper of the Nirakara. He did not believe in Shiva, Kali, or Krishna. He used to make fun of them and say that Kali lived on the offerings of rice and banana, and that Krishna danced like a monkey when the gopis clapped their hands. Okay, so now, here's what I want to say. with regard to just a linguistic issue, a terminological issue, Sri Ramakrishna uses the term nirakar in Bengali, nirakar, which is the Sanskrit term nirakara, which means formless, a lot throughout the gospel. And I think we need to be careful when he refers to nirakara. Why? Because in some context, you have to look at the surrounding context. In some context, when he says nirakara, he has in mind nirakara saguna, formless but personal. So for instance, I'll give you an example. One place in the gospel, he's talking to Brahma Samaj followers who believe in the formless but personal God. And he says, look, it's fine that you don't accept God with form, but you guys are bhaktas like me. You're devotees too because you believe in the personal God. You see, he's nuanced enough to recognize that they're bhaktas. They believe in the personal God and they worship him as a servant and so on and so forth, right? But there are other contexts in which when he uses the same term, nirakar, the context suggests strongly that he has in mind nirakara nirguna. And I think that's the case in this, what I just read to you here. When he says one should not discuss the discipline of the nirakar or the path of knowledge with the bhakta. That's clearly, he's contrasting the meditation on the formless with bhakti, which means it can't be the Brahma Samaj kind of bhakti or Islam or whatever. It has to be the extreme classical Advaita Vedanta. So that needs to be nirakara nirguna. So I think this is a really important interpretive issue. When we're studying the gospel and we find Sri Ramakrishna talking about the formless God, it could be the formless but personal God in some contexts, but in other contexts, it's formless but impersonal of classical Advaita Vedanta. And you have to be very careful. And I think Kabir, in a way, Sri Ramakrishna will sometimes push Kabir in the more classical Advaitic direction, nirakara nirguna, and saying he was a kind of jnani and he didn't believe in bhakti at all in a certain sense. But then other places, he's happy to say that Kabir was a bhakta, but of the formless personal variety. And then in other places, he's co-opting Kabir and enlisting him into his own Vijnana Vedanta team and saying that, he also believes in the nirguna, saguna, like he believed in God with form, without form, with attributes, without attributes, just like me. So Kabir can kind of, he seems to be playing it in multiple ways. He kind of pulls them in different directions. And I'll give you one more reference here with respect to Kabir. An entry at the very end of the gospel, May 7th, 1887. This is months after Sri Ramakrishna leaves his body. Naren, Swami Medhananda, sings a song, one of his favorites. It's a Kabir song. You know which one? Guess. It's sung a lot by our monks. Prabhu me golam, which means, Lord, you are my master, and I am your servant. The whole song is about that. So this song is clearly a devotional song. It's devotion toward the formless but personal God, right? You are a servant, calling on God as your master. The translation of the song is, O Lord, I am thy servant am I. O Lord, thou art my master my master art thou. And so on and so forth. I can read the rest of it. This is Kabir's song. From thee I have received 2 pieces of bread and a kaupan. It's a kind of cloth, a loincloth. When I sing thy name, devotion wells up in my heart and shields me from harm. Thou art the master, the all-compassionate. This I repeat, O Lord. So in this song, I think Kabir is clearly a bhakta, but a devotee of the formless but personal God. So that's one thing to keep in mind. There's this question, I want to raise it for the online audience, for anybody who's interested in taking a stab at this. What is your take on Kabir's theology? What is Kabir's conception of ultimate reality? Does he believe in God as exclusively formless but personal, in the way that Sikhism does, for instance? Or is Kabir broader and more of a Vijnana Vedantan? Does he believe that God is both with form and without form, both personal and impersonal? Or is Kabir a radical classical Advaita Vedantan and conceives the ultimate truth as nirakara nirguna, as impersonal, attributeless pure consciousness, formless pure consciousness? I'm actually curious what the range of responses will be to this question. And finally, there's this really interesting comment made by Sri Ramakrishna, which I think is worth dwelling on. He says, the jnanis think of God without form. They don't accept divine incarnations. or they don't accept the divine incarnation. Let me read the Bengali. Gyanira niraka chinta kore, tara avatar mane na. They don't accept the avatara. That's okay. This raises a number of issues, which are quite important and interesting. Okay. At the very end of his life, Sri Ramakrishna is on his deathbed, and Naren still doesn't believe that Sri Ramakrishna is God incarnate, and thinks that to himself. He thinks to himself, if Sri Ramakrishna, in the midst of this terrible agony and suffering, tells me now that he is God incarnate, I will believe him. At that very moment, Sri Ramakrishna, who read his mind, said, you still don't believe me? He who is Rama and he who is Krishna is now Ramakrishna in this body, but not in your Vedantic sense. Not in your Vedantic sense. What did Sri Ramakrishna mean when he said, not in your Vedantic sense? Number one, another terminological issue, which is very, very important for understanding the gospel. The word Vedanta, Sri Ramakrishna uses it a lot. And Nikalanji faithfully translates it as Vedanta, right? And so Sri Ramakrishna will sometimes say, in Vedantic reasoning, for instance, Vedantic vichara, Vedanta vichara, you say, Brahman is not this, Brahman is not that, the world is a dream, and so on and so forth. What kind of Vedanta does he have in mind there? Advaita Vedanta. But Vedanta is broader than that. Vedanta has many schools. She mentioned Dvaita Vedanta, somebody else mentioned Ramanuja's Vishtadvaita Vedanta. They're all equally Vedantic. Advaita Vedanta is just one school of Vedanta. But in the 19th century, when Sri Ramakrishna was around and talking, the term Vedanta had become synonymous with Advaita Vedanta because Advaita enjoyed a kind of monopoly, or it was kind of hegemonic at the time. So people just equated Vedanta with Advaita Vedanta. Sri Ramakrishna was aware of other Vedantic schools because he talks about Ramanuja in several places. He was aware of dualism too because he talked about dualistic worship as well. But somehow the term Vedanta, when he uses the term Vedanta, he usually means Advaita Vedanta. So now, going back to what he said to Naren at the end of his life, he said that he who is Rama and Krishna is now Ramakrishna in this body, but not in your Vedantic sense, means not in the sense of your classical Advaita Vedanta, it seems to me. That's what he's saying. Now, what does he mean by that? If he does mean classical Advaita, you might ask, well, why doesn't classical Advaita Vedanta accept the incarnation? So some of you have studied Shankara's Advaita Vedanta, or may have watched some of Sarvappa Banerjee's videos or something. Is there anything? What aspect of classical Advaita Vedanta precludes the possibility of believing in an incarnation? Any thoughts on this? Why? Or can you disagree with Sri Ramakrishna on this and say, wait a minute, but why wouldn't Shankara accept that God came in the form of Krishna? Didn't Shankara write a commentary on the Gita, and Krishna comes and says, I'm God? And what's your take on this? Yeah, can you give him the mic, Bala?
I think he's only referring to that consciousness, which is the ultimate Brahman, is there in all, like in that sense, but not that, because we all say, like you said in Advaita, everything is God, but not in that sense. I think he's saying there's a special manifestation which was in Rama and which in Krishna. No?
Yeah, very good. I think that's right. And especially the context, I think, justifies that, because in the context, he gives this story of Krishna and Arjuna, and then Sri Ramakrishna's moral of the story is divine, explaining it from the standpoint of classical Advaita, Gyanis. He says, divine incarnations without number appear and disappear on the tree of the absolute Brahman. Which it sounds like it's a kind of like trivialization of the avatara. It's a kind of saying like, we're all incarnations. And in fact, in another place in the gospel, Naren, Swami Medhananda, has a debate with Girish in the presence of Sri Ramakrishna about whether it's possible for God to incarnate in the form of a human being. And what does Naren say? Let me just read you this bit of it. In fact, the way that the debate starts is funny. Sri Ramakrishna turns to Girish. I should like to hear you and Narendra argue in English. Sri Ramakrishna doesn't know a word of English, but he just wants to be amused. So they start debating, but they debate in Bangla rather than in English, so that Sri Ramakrishna can understand. And Naren says, God is infinity. How is it possible for us to comprehend him? He dwells in every human being. it is not the case that he manifests himself through one person only. So I think this is the Bala interpretation. Let's not, yeah. Call it the Bala interpretation. We'll start a new Bala school of thought. And then, okay. So, but I think this helps illuminate what Sri Ramakrishna has in mind, maybe, which is that in a certain sense, you are just as much of an incarnation as Krishna and Christ and Ramakrishna, right? Why? Because everybody's Brahman, non-dual Brahman. If Brahman is non-dual, that means Brahman's everywhere. And so everybody's equally Brahman. Here, at this point in the debate, Sri Ramakrishna adds a very important qualification. He corrects Naran. He says, tenderly, I quite agree with Narendra. God is everywhere. But then you must remember that there are different manifestations of his power in different beings. At some places, there is a manifestation of his avidya shakti, and in fact, it should be her avidya shakti, her power of ignorance. At others, a manifestation of her vidya shakti, her power of knowledge. He also uses the terms avidya maya and vidya maya, the maya of ignorance and the maya of knowledge. Through different instruments, God's power is manifest in different degrees, greater and smaller. Therefore, all people are not equal. It's a funny way to put the last sentence. But all people are not equal. It's a fact. We're all God. And yet, each of us manifests the divine to varying degrees. And his definition of the avatara, the incarnation, is a maximal degree of manifestation of the divine, which, he says, Gyanis won't accept. Now, again, we can come back to this question and say, well, is it really the case that Gyanis won't accept that there are degrees of manifestation of the divine? I think that one could argue that classical Advaita Vedantins might accept it, but with a catch. They'll say, yeah, we believe that Krishna is a greater manifestation of the divine than I am, or that this pillow is. But with this catch, that all of that, the pillow, Krishna, me, the chairs, the trees, are only real from the empirical standpoint. So they bring in this two-tier ontology, and they say that none of it's real from the ultimate standpoint. So they just pull the rug out from under not only Krishna, but also from under everything. So I was thinking that another way of thinking of what Sri Ramakrishna meant when he said, not in your Vedantic sense, he might also have meant, maybe, that don't just think that the incarnation is provisionally real for people who are stuck in this dream world, but that ultimately you'll have to ascend to this higher standpoint of the impersonal absolute. Not in that sense. I'm not an incarnation in that sense. I am eternally real. And I won't be, you don't have to go beyond me to some higher reality, something like that. So anyway, that was my thought. Any other thoughts about what we read today? Or about just not in your Vedantic sense? Yes, Sultan?
I guess this is a question about like the master's response directly after.
Yeah.
He says, I see you found it out. Let me tell you one thing. Once you follow various paths, etc. So I guess I'm just asking, could you elaborate on this with regard to him saying with him, like, don't go to Keshab's place? I was just asking you to elaborate, kind of try to figure out the nuances here.
Yeah, no, that's a great, thank you. Because, exactly. I started the section by talking about Sri Ramakrishna basically scolding M for going to Keshab's Durga Puja and listening to Keshab's discourses. And my analysis of that scolding was that Sri Ramakrishna was basically telling him, you're part of my inner circle and you are my follower, and so you should stick to me. And now he's saying one should follow various paths, one should practice each creed for a time. It seems to be quite explicit. So first of all, let's look at the Bengali here. But it's pretty accurate as far as I can tell. Okay. Oh, yeah. And after I answer that, I want to get to something which is really important, which I forgot to. So thank you for, okay. Yeah. So the thing is, I think he's saying here that if you expose yourself to different spiritual traditions, you broaden your mind, you broaden your outlook, you avoid one-sidedness and fanaticism, and so it's good in that sense. I don't think personally he's encouraging anybody to imitate him in, practicing Shaktism or Tantra and then realizing God and then doing another path. And then, if we can try, but the problem is we're not realizing God through the path, right? So he was actually doing a path, realizing the highest in that path as understood by that path, and then going on to the next path. But we're kind of dabbling, and so there is a difference in the way that we, that's one thing. But he does seem to say one should follow various paths. I think another way of putting this is if we take it in the context of other places where he says basically there's something to learn from each tradition. And so Brahma Samaj, we can learn something about bhakti from the Brahma Samaj. From Vaishnavism, he tells Brahma Samaj followers, he says, there's something to learn from Vaishnavism. Even if you don't accept that Krishna is God, tantukunebe, you can learn from the longing of the gopis, the cowherd women, for Krishna. You see what I mean? So there's something to learn from each path. So maybe we can interpret in that way and to avoid contradiction with the previous passage. Yeah, Bala? Can you give a mic?
The key word seems to be following. So does Bangla use the same thing, like follow different paths, or does it say exposure?
Okay, let me tell you the Bangla. I just found it. So, ki jano, shob dharmo ekbar kore nite hoy, shob pot diye chole aste hoy. He does, Nikhilanji is not wrong here. One needs to follow each dharma. Shob dharma, sarva dharma, shob dharma. There are two sentences. First one is shob dharma ekbar kore nite hoy. You have to do them. And then shob pot diye chole aste hoy. You have to follow all the paths, basically. He writes it. He says one should practice each creed for a time, but the metaphor is of a path, and so you have to follow each path for some time. Okay. I do want to mention one thing which I think is actually crucially important. So before the class ends, I'm sorry that we're running a little late, but here we go. So Sri Ramakrishna says this in English. I'll read the English translation again, then I'll look at the Bengali. He says, "But I accept God with form when I'm in the company of people who believe in that ideal, and I also agree with those who believe in the formless God." The original Bengali here is, "Ami shakar badir kache shakar, abar nirakar badir kache nirakar." This is quite interesting. I think it's interesting. The original Bengali means among Sakarvadis, those who believe in the Sakara God, the God with form. He says, Ami Shakar Badir Kache Shakar. To them, I am Sakara, is literally what he's saying. I am with form. If you take it literally. And then Abar Nirakar Badir Kache Nirakar. Among Nirakaravadis, those who believe in the Nirakara, Kache Nirakar. I am Nirakara. I am formless. That's how I interpret it. That's how I'm taking the Bengali grammar here. But Nikhilanji says, I accept God with form when I am in the company of people who believe in that. I accept God with form, but that's actually not what's said. Now, you can easily interpret it. I spoke to one native Bengali speaker and I asked him, and he said, yeah, his first intuition was going with Nikhilananda before he even knew how Nikhilanji had translated. He's like, yeah, what Sri Ramakrishna means is he accepts among people who believe in God with form, he also believes in God with form. And then I mentioned this. I was like, wait a minute, but doesn't the Bengali just say among those who believe in God with form, he is with form, that I am with form? He literally says, I am Sakara, I am Nirakara. And then he looked at the context, because now look at the context. It's quite interesting. I think M reads this statement in the way that I'm suggesting. Because M says, you are as infinite as he of whom we have been talking. Truly no one can fathom your depth. And here, the translation occludes the wordplay. Let me read what M says. Shohashe, laughing, smiling. Jar kotha hocche tinio jemon ononto, apnio temni ononto. Ananta means infinite. Just as that God that we're talking about is infinite, you are as infinite as that God, Ananta. And then he says, Apnad onto pawa jaina. One can never find an anta to you. Anta. See, ananta means infinite. Just like the word infinite is infinite. Finite means with a limit. In is negating it, right? The opposite of that. Exactly like that. Ananta. Anta means having a limit, finite. And ananta means infinite, right? It's negating it. So M is telling him, you, Sri Ramakrishna, are infinite, therefore nobody can ever place a limit to you or place an anta to you. And then Sri Ramakrishna says, in the translation, it's, Master, I see you have found it out. But what's the Bengali? Tumi buje felecho. This is a very subtle thing, and I hope you don't think I'm hair splitting here. But see, the English here is, I see you have found it out. There's this impersonal article, it. There's no it in the Bengali. Tumi buje felecho. I think that the better translation would be, you found me out. You found me out. See, this is very interesting. I think that what's happening here is that Sri Ramakrishna is indirectly hinting to M that I am the infinite divine who is formless in one aspect, and among people who believe in God without form, I am the formless to them. And among those who believe in God with form, I am equally God with form in different forms. Like Mothur Babu once had a vision, pacing back and forth on the balcony. And when he's walking in one direction, he sees Kali. And when he's walking the other direction, he sees Shiva. So Sri Ramakrishna in these different forms. And then M immediately picks up on that. And I think he doesn't interpret Sri Ramakrishna's statement along the lines of Nikalananda. He interprets it along the lines of, you, Sri Ramakrishna, are both with form and without form. And that's why he says you are without limit. And so in that context, I think it's better to translate Sri Ramakrishna's final response as, you found me out. My infinitude, my vastness, that I'm both with form and without form, both personal and impersonal. Okay. Any final thoughts about this before we wrap up the class? Or are there online questions? And I'll give you first dibs, unless, okay, let's get an online question. Okay.
In your discourse on Sunday, you described how Sri Ramakrishna touched Narendra and gave him an Advaita experience. Mm-hmm. Which book contains this incident?
Oh, okay. I bet I even know the person who's asked the question.
I wonder if it's hagiography.
Yeah, Kumara Kantirava, right? Yeah, because he asked the question in the YouTube comments. Okay, so the answer is Lila Prasanga. It's found in Sharananji's biography of Sri Ramakrishna, and it's there. And if you know Bengali, I'm guessing from Kantirava that you don't. But in any case, ask a Bengali friend to read you the Bengali passage. And I quote the whole passage in Swami Vivekananda's Vedanta Cosmopolitanism, chapter 2. And you can find it there. But it's not hagiography. It's a quotation, a direct quotation of Swamiji's. Swami Vivekananda himself is narrating this event, as quoted by Sharananji in his biography of Sri Ramakrishna. Any other questions?
Do you think that the talk of renunciation of lust and gold in the gospel acts as a catalyst even for modern day aspiring monks of the Ramakrishna order?
Of course, I hope so. What else would it do? Hope we haven't fallen that far from the tree. But so any other questions?
Just a comment on the Kabir thing. This person says, Kabir was Vijnani, but he also attacked all kinds of religious systems of his time, mm-hmm. God with form, without form, personal and impersonal. He was just tired of religious hypocrisy and vanity.
Okay, that's an interesting take on Kabir, is that his conception of God was vast, more like a Vijnana Vedanta, but he was really against religious fanaticism, dogmatism, institutionalization, and hypocrisy. Yeah, that's an interesting take. Thank you. Okay. Any final thoughts or questions to wrap this up? Thank you. It's a very interesting class. Om Shanti 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 Hari Om Tat Sat Sri Ramakrishna Arpanamastu. And before we stop the recording, let me just announce there's a second gospel class this month, and it's on Wednesday, January 22nd at 7:30 p.m. Hope to see you there. Thank you.